Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we're going to do a review of chapter 5 of the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery. Title chapter 5 is Reconstruction Period. The Reconstruction period is the time right after the end of slavery. Booker considers Reconstruction to be from 1867 to 1878. This would include the time that Booker was at Hampton and teaching in West Virginia. Booker says that there were two main ideas on the minds of black people during the Reconstruction period. He writes, quote, "One of these was the crave for Greek and Latin learning, and the other was the desire to hold office." End quote. There was an intense desire among former slaves to acquire education. Booker writes, quote, "During the Reconstruction period, schools, both day and night, were filled to overflowing with people of all ages and conditions," end quote. He continues, quote, "The ambition to secure an education was most praiseworthy and encouraging." End quote. There was a belief that education would free people from the hardships of manual labor, and learning a foreign language like Greek or Latin would make them feel supernatural. Booker says that most of our people who received some education became preachers or teachers as an easy way to make a living. He says some of these quote unquote teachers could do little more than write their own names. Regarding the preachers, Booker writes, quote, the ministry was the profession that suffered the most and still suffers, though there has been great improvements, on account of not only ignorant, but in many cases immoral men who claimed that they were called to preach," end quote. Booker talked about how some preachers were called to preach in a church. He used words like getting shot by a bullet. The individuals would be speechless. They would be motionless. I guess it's, just they caught the Holy Ghost. And this was something that Booker feared. He feared, since he got an education, that he would be called to preach. So he was worried about that. Booker repeats how there was an overabundance of preachers. He mentions a 200-member church that had 18 preachers. But he also said, quote, "Within 2 or 3 decades, a very large portion of the unworthy ones will have disappeared," end quote. So he's talking about how the ministry and preachers got better over time. Booker says, quote, "During the whole of the Reconstruction period, our people throughout the South looked to the federal government for everything, very much as a child looks to its mother. This was not natural. This was not unnatural," end quote. Booker continues, quote, "The central government gave them," and he's talking about ex-slaves or former slaves, "freedom, and the whole nation had been enriched for more than 2 centuries by the labor of the Negro. Even as a youth and later in manhood, I had the feeling that it was cruelly wrong in the central government at the beginning of our freedom to fail to make some provision for the general education of our people in addition to what the states might do, so that the people would be better prepared for the duties of citizenship," end quote. Booker also says, quote, "I cannot help feeling that it would have been wiser if some plan could have been put in operation which would have made the possession of a certain amount of educational property or both a test for the exercise of the franchise, and a way provided by which this test should be made to apply honestly and squarely to both the white and black races," end quote. Although Booker was still a youth during Reconstruction, he had a feeling that mistakes were being made. Booker felt that the Reconstruction policy was artificial and forced. Booker felt that the policies of Reconstruction were a distraction for the ex-slaves or colored people. He writes, quote, "The general political agitation drew the attention of our people away from the fundamental matters of perfecting themselves in the industries at their doors and in securing property," end quote. Booker talks about the allure of the political life and almost becoming a politician. He writes, quote, "I was kept from doing so," he's talking about political life, "by the feeling that I would be helping in a more substantial way by assisting in the laying of the foundation of the race through a generous education of the hand, head, and heart. End quote. Booker saw colored men who were legislators and county officers who couldn't read or write and whose morals were as weak as their education. Booker notes that not all colored men who were in office during Reconstruction were unworthy. He mentions officials such as Senator B.K. Bruce, Governor Pinchback, and an ex-governor of Georgia, Mr. Bullock. Booker recalls that without education and without experience in government, wait a minute. Booker recalls that without education and without experience in government, many colored men made what he called, quote unquote, tremendous mistakes. But Booker still had faith in his people. He writes, quote, more and more I am convinced that the final solution of the political end of our race problem will be for each state that finds it necessary to change the law bearing upon the franchise to make the law apply with absolute honesty and without opportunity for double dealing or evasion to both races alike, end quote. Any other approach, Booker considered, quote, a sin that at some time we shall have to pay for, end quote. By the time of the fall of 1878, Booker had taught in Malden, West Virginia for 2 years and succeeded in preparing several young men and women, including his two brothers, to go to Hampton Institute. Booker spent 8 months studying at an unnamed institution in Washington, D.C. I think this institution was probably Howard University. That's just my opinion. He doesn't say it in the book. As far as I saw, there was no industrial training at this school. There was no industrial training given to the students, and he compared this to the training that he got at Hampton Institute that emphasized the industries. In general, Booker noticed that the students in Washington were more prepared than the students in Hampton, were more pampered than the students in Hampton. Booker felt that the Washington students were more educated but less prepared for life. While Booker was in Washington, he says the city was, quote, crowded with colored people, many of whom had recently come from the South, end quote. Booker believed that Washington was an attractive place for members of the colored race. Part of this attraction was due to, quote, they could have protection of the law in the District of Columbia, end quote. Booker, so I guess he's talking about the federal law about slavery. They would be guaranteed protection in D.C. Booker says D.C. became a mix of worthy citizens and other men who were superficial about life, and others who were superficial about life, not just men. He recalls a young colored man who made, quote, made less than $4 a week, but spent more than $2 on Sunday to ride a buggy up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, which is where the White House is, to try to convince the world that they were worth thousands of dollars. So that's end quote. Booker says, quote, among a large class, there seemed to be a dependence upon the government for every conceivable thing, end quote. He continues, quote, the members of this class had little ambition to create a position for themselves, but wanted the federal official to create one for them, end quote. Booker ends the chapter talking about how girls in D.C. were taught by their mothers in a crude way. He's talking about laundry, just manual labor, just taught what were considered basic fundamentals at that time. He mentions how these girls would go to school for 6 or 8 years, and when they finished, they wanted what he says, quote, more costly dresses, more costly hats and shoes, end quote. Booker says, quote, while their wants have been increased, their ability to supply their wants had not been increased in the same degree, end quote. While their time at school made them less receptive to the manual labor that their mothers taught them, their time at school made them less receptive to the manual labor that their mothers had taught them previously. Booker ends the chapter writing, quote, I favor any kind of training, whether in the languages or mathematics, that gives strength and culture to the mind, but at the same time, give them the most thorough training in the latest and best methods of laundrying and other kindred occupations. So he believed in striving for higher education and pursuit of liberal arts, but also not forgetting and continuing to strengthen your fundamentals and things that we consider manual labor or things that we may look down on. He still stressed those skills. So that'd be the end of chapter 5. Make sure you read the book for yourselves. If you disagree with anything I said, comment. If you like anything I said, you can comment as well. If you want to donate to Booker T. Washington, I believe it's www.tuskegee.edu. That's the university that he built. I think that's the best way to contribute to him. I want to thank everybody for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next chapter, chapter 6. Thank you. And that's all I got. Peace out.